check up the fast susceptible anemia during pregnancy.
We welcome the students of the PGDDHM course. Now we are pleased to invite Group Captain Dr. S. Mukherjee with us. He is the Director of the Medical Services Health and also a Senior Advisor. Talk to you on the topic of the public health approach to epidemics. And we are glad that you could spare time to be with us today. So, Dr. Mukherjee.
The topic we'll be covering is epidemics and their importance in public health. One should understand that the very origin of public health goes back to the origin of epidemics. The requirement for public health was felt somewhere as long back as the 14th century, and that was when we first see certain laws, statutes, certain actions which were required to be introduced by governments to fight against epidemics. Before we go into those details, a quick revision of what is the book definition of epidemics. Epidemic can be defined as an occurrence of a disease in a frequency which is clearly in excess of normal expectation. Now, each of these words are important. Occurrence of a disease in a frequency, when we are talking about frequency, as you know, disease is always counted as rates, and we are talking about incidence of a disease, that is the number of fresh cases in a defined population in a demarcated period of time. That is what is known as disease frequency. We will be talking about that in little more detail, and which is clearly in excess of normal expectation. Now, this again is a very peculiar wording, because what exactly is a person's expectation? For example, today if we have a case of plague in Delhi, it is beyond normal expectation. So even one case of plague is an epidemic of plague. Similarly, a case of cholera in, say, United Kingdom. They don't have cholera, but if they did have one case also, it will be declared an epidemic. So this is where the technicality of declaring an epidemic is concerned. Before we go into those details, just quick review of the history of epidemics. As we said, epidemics were the main reason for evolution of public health in the world over. In fact, the earliest record is somewhere in the Roman or the Roman Empire, where certain laws were enforced regarding movements of diseased persons, etc. But the more nearer history which we have is that in the 14th century, where quarantine laws were laid down by certain countries in Europe, where ships which were considered infected, they didn't know what was the infection, plague was the cause, they didn't know that it was caused by rats, they didn't know that the rat flea was involved. In fact, the microscope was not invented at that point of time, and they introduced a 40-day period for these ships to not be allowed to come into the harbor, and that is the origin of this word of quarantine. Similar kind of examples are there in history. The cholera epidemics which swept Europe and USA, today we don't see them, and that led to the great sanitary awakening. The entire evolution of what we see as the Western developed countries today wasn't there even a few centuries back, and it was sort of forced through when cholera outbreaks were sweeping London. In fact, there is a very famous study done by a gentleman called Dr. John Snow, where they purely by observation he managed to narrow down the source of an epidemic of cholera to certain water related supply problems. They did not know that cholera was caused by drinking infected water at that point of time. Epidemics have been recorded of typhus fever, which was caused by lice. Even as recently as the world wars, we had lice-borne outbreaks of typhus. It was known to have occurred during the Stalingrad siege, where people were staying in very cold, inhospitable climates, and lice infestation was rampant, and a lot of people lost their lives because of typhus fever. Smallpox is more recent in our memories. Until vaccination was available and other public health measures were introduced, smallpox today remains one of the biggest achievements of public health till now. In India too, we have had major cholera outbreaks, especially in the eastern part of the country, Bengal, Assam, etc. To the extent the classical version of cholera, the classical bacteria of cholera, is known to have originated from what today is Bangladesh, or undivided Bengal as we would like to call it at that point of time. Plague epidemics have been reported in India from time to time. We are quite conversant with malaria epidemics. More recent times we keep reading about dengue fever, Japanese encephalitis. Influenza epidemics have been spreading all over the world. In fact, they have spread across geographical boundaries, across countries, and that invariably is a cause for concern today, especially with the faster mode of travel. These types of epidemics are called pandemics, and there are certain variants of the influenza virus, like the avian flu virus, the swine flu virus, which have been known to cause this problem. Just a pictorial depiction of what London was London is today, is a very clean and neat city, but only a century or two back, these are actual cartoons where night soil was being lifted by manual labor, and the cartoon on the other side shows what the Thames water, the Thames river water, was considered to be so infected. Today, I believe you can drink the water straight on without any problem. Incidentally, all these activities of sanitary awakening and sanitary revolution were not done by doctors alone. There were engineers involved, there were administrators involved, and that is what makes it important that public health today is a multi-speciality field which has a role for every one of us. Before we go into the roles, let us just see what is public health's role in investigation of an epidemic. The investigation and the prevention and control of epidemic are the two broad areas which we need to focus on. But one must remember that the investigation, though it is important, and I'll be dealing with that in a stepwise fashion, is important, but the prevention and control must also go hand in hand. It is important to start both the steps concurrently. Even the investigation steps which I will be mentioning will not be done in the chronological order necessarily. You will be seeing as we go along, and we will be describing each of these steps, that you don't need to confine yourself to step 1 and then move to step 2. This is just an easy way to perhaps understand how this investigation is supposed to proceed. The first step in investigation of an outbreak is verification of the diagnosis. Today there are invariably all kinds of rumors, especially with the media being very proactive nowadays. We keep hearing of reports and rumors which may not even be confirmed. So it is very important to first verify the diagnosis. Usually the report that will come is that of a syndrome. A syndrome is a complex of symptoms and signs, clinical features. It will not be a diagnosis of a disease. So it might be as non-specific as a lot of children are having diarrhea, or a lot of children are having vomiting, or a fair amount of people have developed fever with rash. So it could be many other things. It need not necessarily be the diagnosis of the disease that we are looking at so soon. It is important, therefore, to verify the symptoms, the clinical features. You have to identify the distribution of the cases. The classical way that we advise people to see it is in terms of place distribution, person distribution, and time distribution. We'll be talking about that in a little while. But important to classify the cases. For example, just to identify, a place may be as simple as one village, or say a particular school. Person distribution basically means children of a particular sub-center who have all received immunization on a particular day, who all fell ill. So that is how you confine your investigation to a particular group, rather than start wasting your time in searching for more cases. Time distribution, we have some graphs, we will be talking about them in little detail. That will basically give you an indication what kind of disease you are looking at. It is important to confirm through some rapid lab tests. It is important not to go for something very, very elaborate at this point of time. Even a simple lab test which will give an indication. Those who are medical people among the audience will understand. Cholera outbreak, the simplest one which can be done by anyone, is something called a hanging drop preparation. A hanging drop preparation of the stool is something which does not require anything more elaborate than a particular type of slide and a particular microscope. That's all that is required. You can see the cholera bacteria in that and make a tentative diagnosis that you are dealing with cholera. The second step is to confirm that there is actually an epidemic going on. Now, this we said in the outset itself that epidemic is considered in excess of normal expectation. What is the normal expectation is to be based on comparison with records, and the ideal way is to examine or compare the records of the same disease for the same area for the past 3 years. In fact, those who are statistically inclined will perhaps understand that what we use is 2 standard deviations higher than the mean expected value for that particular area. But you need not go into so much detail. What is simpler is to just see the incidence rate and see if it is excess than the average for the past 3 years. As I said, in certain kind of diseases, whether it's plague or cholera, it will be termed as an epidemic even if there is a single case, because we do not have a normal expectancy of plague or cholera even as a single case in a particular defined population. The third step is to start making a list of the cases. This is called a line list of cases. In fact, what is advised is a nominal roll of all cases in chronological order. What we note down is the name, the age, the gender, residential address, workplace address. Most important is the date and time of onset of symptoms. This is the chronological component, this column 5, from where you can decide that where exactly you are going to place this particular individual. The main symptoms, whether it is vomiting, loose motions, fever, which is there, those need to be noted down, and the name and address of the medical facility with the date of admission or the date of reporting. So this will be a systematic way of recording all the cases, which will help you in diagnosing what kind of disease you are dealing with. Secondly, what is the likely cause of the infection. Define the population at risk. This is the fourth step. Here again we will go into the details. Estimate is made by studying the distribution pattern in terms of person, place and time. As I said, person can be in terms of the children, the women, the gender. This is just examples which I have given. Say all women in a particular area have developed. So that is one way of saying that these women were perhaps in some kind of a gathering where they picked up the infection. Workers in one office or those who have eaten at the same sort of hostel or dining hall or whatever, this will help you narrowing down on what kind of population is at risk. The next is the place distribution, whether it is a village, a particular building, a particular office or a school, and then the time distribution, whether it is all taken place in a very short period. We will be talking about that in graphs. Particular day of a festival, suppose it has followed after a lot of people had gathered at a particular fair, village fair, have eaten something there, and a lot of people have fallen ill or deaths have occurred soon thereafter. So you can narrow it down to a common exposure by examining the time distribution. Certain types of diseases which are more of the seasonal variety can be noted, whether it is in the winter month or rainy season. The flu virus is known, influenza virus is known to transmit more during the winter months because it survives easily in the atmosphere. Next step is to develop what is known as a valid case definition. Now this is important because you have to quickly ask your paramedical staff or even health volunteers, healthcare volunteers to rapidly identify cases in a population. You have identified the risk group, maybe all children in a particular village. Now only about 5 or 6 have reported with some illness to the sub-center or to the PHC. What happens to the rest of the children? So somebody from the paramedical staff or the health volunteer staff or the village ASHA worker or the village health guide, somebody has to rapidly identify the cases. Now for doing this, they must be given what is known as a case definition. This is your job as a person who's guiding the whole investigation. The case definition must be adequately sensitive not to miss out actual cases, but should be reasonably specific to exclude those who are unlikely to be having the disease. Now we classically would like to call them as suspect case, probable case, and a definite case or a confirmed case. The suspect case is the one who is going to be brought or diagnosed in the community by a paramedical worker or a health volunteer. Now for them it is important only to know some basic signs and symptoms. For example, if you are looking at say cholera, all you need to define is loose motions and vomiting for last 48 hours. So that is a good enough definition. Any person who is having loose motions and vomiting for last 48 hours is a suspect case. He or she should be brought to the dispensary or to the medical officer. The probable case is diagnosed by the general practitioner or by the dispensary, and a lab test is only one which will confirm the case, and that is usually done by the MOH or the DHO or the CMO of the district to define how many confirmed cases of a particular disease we are dealing with. The sixth step, again as I said, this is not necessarily in chronological order, you have to continue to do it in sequence. Develop an epidemiological case sheet. Now this is something quite different from those who are my doctor friends will know what a clinical case sheet looks like, but there are other factors which need to be noted down in an epidemiological case sheet, and that includes all factors relevant to the mode of transmission. For example, if you are looking at cholera, it has to include all history of food and water intake, and since there is incubation period of 1 to 5 days. For those who are not very familiar with this word, incubation period is from the time, the duration from the time the infection or the infective organism has gone into the body till the individual or the patient develops the symptoms. So that in case of cholera varies between 1 to 5 days. So you have to perforce take the history of intake of water and food for the last 5 days in case you are dealing with a case of cholera. It again depends from disease to disease. Next step, which is most important, is to organize a laboratory. Please understand that you are looking at mass number of cases. It is unlikely that you are going to land up with a lab which has the capability of taking on too many samples at one time. So you need to augment their resources. You have to plan for collection of samples, transportation of the sample, and examination in the labs. You need sufficient equipment, you need sufficient trained personnel in labs to make the quick diagnosis. Anticipate the type of sample that will be required, whether it is blood, stool, vomitus. Cerebrospinal fluid is of course something which is taken from labs, and this is used from meningitis outbreaks. And even from the environment, you may have to take food samples and water samples. So your lab must be in a position, firstly, to handle so much samples. Secondly, there must be adequate methodology of collecting the samples and transporting them. It is important to remember that many of these samples will deteriorate if you do not take precautions of collection and transportation as is required. The next step is to contact the administration and the engineering authorities. At the outset I said public health is definitely not the sole prerogative of the doctors. It is a role or an important field where everybody from the administration, from the engineers, from the security people, everybody needs to get involved. And the sooner these people are alerted, it is better. So the district or block administrators need to be alerted. The administrative measures may include requirement to commandeer resources. You may have to increase the resources for a particular area which may not be there available there, like buildings for treating mass cases. You may have a lot of cholera cases. The easiest way is to use, say, a school building or something like that, where more patients can be treated, because your hospital may not be accessible and villagers from nearby villages may be landing up there. You need vehicles, you need water tankers, relief to the affected area. The public health engineers have a very important role to involve to checking the water supply, ensuring chlorination of water, and in case pipeline leakages are suspected to be cause of the outbreak, they must make sure that this is repaired at the priority. Next step is to collect the information. It is a more detailed information that we are looking at now, and it is to extend the effort to detect fresh cases where detailed history is taken to identify possible source of infection. In case certain outbreaks like viral hepatitis of the A type or the E type have longer incubation periods, so you may have to take a history which is stretching 2 to 6 weeks. It's a little difficult because one does not necessarily recollect history of intake of food or water which is maybe 2 weeks or even 6 weeks old. All general practitioners, alternative medicine practitioners need to be surveyed to include all possible cases. They need to be alerted what is the case definition that you are looking at, because many of the patients may not even land up at the sub-center or the primary health center. You may think that you are dealing with X number of cases, but actually the cases may be far more because they may have preferred to go to the more traditional healers or the GPs who are available close by. After getting all these lists, the final line listing of cases is done chronologically, and the information on those who did not suffer from the disease is also taken, and that invariably provides a clue and is used as controls to calculate attack rates. For example, if you find a food poisoning in a particular place which involves both vegetarians and non-vegetarians in almost similar numbers, it is likely that you are dealing with a vegetarian food, because a non-vegetarian food is not consumed by the vegetarians. The reverse is quite common. So this is a common sense approach, and you need to keep your let's say way of thinking in a systematic way so that you don't miss out obvious information. Describing the epidemic. Describing the epidemic is the next step in terms of the attack rate, that is the incidence among those who are exposed and those who are not exposed to the suspected source of contaminant. Say in a food poisoning outbreak in a particular fair, everybody who ate each item is noted down, and the attack rate difference gives an indication that it is which is the likely food item which can be called maybe suspected as the cause of the outbreak. Describe the clinical and epidemiological profile of the cases. We have said it is important to note down the clinical symptoms and signs and the epidemiological profile, and also describe the cases in terms of person, place and time distribution. Also go into some details about the environmental conditions just before and during the outbreak. A simple thing like a flood or unseasonal rainfall, that may give an indication that you are dealing with a particular disease. Dengue fever outbreak in Delhi has been known to take place post unseasonal rainfalls. somewhere in the later part of September, etc. This is a way to graphically, let's say, mark the cases. This is showing a common vehicle point source epidemic in which the x-axis, as we call this one, is got the dates and the y-axis has got the number of cases. So it's a very simple thing. Suppose there are 3 cases on 17th of April, you mark till here. If there are 7 or 8 cases, you mark till here on 18th. On 19th you have got 10 cases. On 20th you have got 12 cases. That's all. That's as simple as that. And once you have marked it, you join the midpoints and you get this epidemic curve. Now, why this is important to do is that the typical curve gives an indication of what you are dealing with. An epidemic curve which has a sharp onset with abrupt decline and all cases in one incubation period is classically seen in food poisoning outbreaks, which takes place on being exposed to a single point. A slight variation to this is when there is a continuous source exposure. This occurs when a vehicle gets contaminated. For example, water supply is contaminated. You will not find a similar kind of picture. If you see it graphically, it shows a gradual onset with a slow decline, and the peak is not sharp. Here the peak is more like a plateau. This is classically seen in waterborne outbreaks of viral hepatitis, cholera, typhoid. So this is just a way of part of interest, that if you can get this kind of a graphical depiction, you will be very quick in identifying what you are dealing with. The next type is a propagated source of epidemic, where the source itself is multiplying. One case of measles passes it to 5 of his classmates, say a school child. Those 5 in turn infect another 5. So that is what is being depicted. And here it is slowly waves are formed. There are notches in between, peaks, and then gradually it declines. And this is typically seen in chickenpox, dengue fever, even malaria. After this, you have to develop a hypothesis. A hypothesis is based on all possible measures that you have thought of. This is a slightly technical thing, so I will not go into too much detail of this. Once you have got all this information, an independent hypothetical cause of the outbreak needs to be made. The testing of this hypothesis is essentially done by biostatistics, and this is when we prove that this outbreak was due to this particular organism or due to this particular contaminant or source of infection. The next step, or the last step, let's put it, is to search for the environmental and causative factors which could have led it, because that would help you to develop some kind of a preventive strategy. Whether it is the environmental factors, whether something went wrong in the food preparation, food storage, food method of serving, details of food handlers and their state of health. That itself, we have heard of a famous case called Typhoid Mary. Now that was a case of a food handler in New York who was a waitress, and she was a carrier of typhoid. She kept infecting the people who she was serving the food item to, and finally she was identified. Her name was Mary, and the famous case of Typhoid Mary is noted in our most of our stories of public health epidemics. Water source, water storage, and method of serving. It's important to note this, because invariably that is the source of contamination. Either the normal source of water supply has failed, maybe a tanker of water or some other alternative source has been made for water collection, and that source may not be a very safe place, so that has led to the outbreak. The final proof will be always by the lab reports. Now, lab reports from samples from the patients or from the source will give you the final proof that what you have thought of, the hypothesis as the cause of the outbreak, is the likely situation. So far we have been talking about how to investigate, but the more important and side-by-side issue, the second aspect of epidemics which we talked about, is the control and prevention. This I'd like to divide into 4 clear categories of intervention. The first category is to control the source of infection. For this, you need to detect and treat cases and the carriers. Now, it is easier said than done, because you do not have necessarily, say you are dealing with a cholera outbreak. Now, each case of cholera is excreting the cholera bacillus in his stool. If that is not disinfected, if the patient is not isolated, he will continue to keep the infection on in that community. So it is important to control the source. Carriers, typhoid Mary is the example which I just now mentioned. She was an undetected person. She herself didn't know that she was carrying that particular bacillus, and carriers are potentially the problem area because they themselves are not aware. Isolation / quarantine if required. Isolation is the word which we use to keep the patients who are become cases away from the rest of the population. Quarantine is used, the word quarantine is used for the contacts of those cases. So quarantine is a particular period, the maximum possible incubation period of that particular disease, where that contact of the patient is not allowed to mix with others. Notification, this is most important, because notification invariably is a method to alert the entire organization. Today it is mandatory to notify the channels of health regarding even a single case of cholera. In fact, it is not only the national, it has the international connotation. Even the World Health Organization has to be alerted if a single case of cholera occurs, is confirmed case of cholera occurs in any part of the world. So this is a mandatory requirement, and this is one of the methods that has been evolved, time tested method to control the source, because all possible resources can be now focused onto that area. In case of zoonosis, this is a category of diseases like plague, etc., where animal reservoirs are involved. Rats are involved in plague. Similarly, swine flu and avian flu had also animal reservoirs. Of course, they mutated and they became human to human transmission. In that situation, control of animal reservoir has no role. The next broad group of action is blocking the channels of transmission. This will depend on what is the channel of transmission of the disease that you are dealing with. If it is a waterborne disease, then protection of the water supply, or if it is a foodborne disease, improving the food hygiene. In fact, proper disposal of night soil and solid waste is also related to this, because the water supply invariably gets contaminated by the infected defecation of the cases. So that cycle has to be broken. In a cholera case, which we talked about just now, is the ideal example which I can think of, where disposal of night soil and solid waste is mandatory. If a cholera case's stool is not disinfected immediately, it is a source of infection further and further into that community. In case of vector-borne diseases, whether it is malaria or more commonly nowadays Japanese encephalitis or dengue fever, we would like to take all possible vector control measures. We know there are anti-adult measures, there are anti-larval measures. Now we would digress from the topic if I go into details of that, but what I wish to highlight is, depending on what is the channel of transmission of the outbreak or the epidemic we are dealing with, you need to introduce measures to block this channel of transmission. Disinfection we have just now talked about. Concurrent disinfection is done when the patient is still around and alive. Terminal disinfection is once he is died and once he is transferred out from that area. Protection of the susceptible population is the third category of action which one needs to focus on. Now here the main criteria is immunization. We are very familiar with the vaccines which we are giving the children. In case of outbreaks, mass vaccination is also done. Those who are perhaps have some memories, when we had the massive refugee input from Bangladesh during the war in 71, the entire refugee camp was vaccinated against cholera. So that is one of the methods of trying to stop an epidemic. Chemoprophylaxis is when you don't use vaccines per se, you use some drugs. The commonest example which we can give you is in meningococcal meningitis infections, where there are certain drugs which are used as chemoprophylaxis, and they can be used to break outbreak, especially in a confined group, in a closed hostel or a camp of people. If you want to break the transmission cycle, the easiest way is to make sure everybody takes a pill of this particular drug. Suppressive treatment is a variation of this which is used in malaria control. You cannot do vector control in wild areas, as you've been introduced, as I've been introduced, I am from the forces, and we have troops who have to move into areas where malaria control is not possible. So what do? We give them certain medicines, anti-malarial drugs, for X period so that they don't develop the disease. They might get the infection, but they don't develop the disease. This is called suppressive treatment. And finally, the personal protective measures. This can vary from boiling your water, chlorinating your water yourself, making sure you drink bottled water perhaps if you are reasonably sure of its origin. In case of vector-borne diseases, whether using bed nets or whether using some kind of mosquito repellents. I mean, these are last line of defense, if you would like to call it. Personal protective measures do help out in certain situations. Lastly, one must develop a long-term early warning system, and this highlights the point of building up what is known as a public health surveillance mechanism. It has to be strong. Even a single case has to be coming to somebody's attention, and this is possible if you regularly generate disease frequency data. If PHC is recording disease frequency data of diarrhea every week from every subcenter, they will immediately be alerted if a subcenter the disease rate is going up. So this is how frequently you can do it, depends on what kind of resources you have, but this is the early warning system we would advise everybody has to develop. And you have to monitor certain environmental risk factors. As I explained, there might be certain diseases which follow certain environmental situations. Floods lead to breakdown in water supply, leads to cholera outbreak. Unseasonal rainfall leads to waterlogging, leads to malaria or dengue fever outbreak. So these are well known factors. One does not have to really need any very elaborate mechanism to develop some kind of an early warning system in this. I'll conclude by saying that the whole approach has to be coordinated, pre-planned response. It has to be well thought out, a plan has to be made. In fact, ideally a contingency has to be rehearsed. It is difficult to do it, I understand, but it is always better if you rehearse a contingency plan to see what all is going wrong in it, and you can make sufficient corrections. Drugs, fluids, lab transportation media, these need to be stocked at least for an initial response. You can always ask for help subsequently, but that initial responders need certain amount of material. And what is must not be lost sight of today is where mass media is playing a major role, and it should not be taken as an adversary. One should not feel that they are trying to publicize and highlight our lacunae. You can use the mass media by making a planned kind of briefing, planned kind of handouts for them, so that they can negate rumors. The biggest panic which occurs in these kind of outbreaks are caused by rumors, and there might be even panic migrations. People run away from a particular place because they feel that they're ill informed, that's all, and you can't blame them. And there has to be a proper cooperation of the population with the healthcare provider. So this in a overview is what I thought would be of interest for any public health practitioner whenever one is thinking of epidemic. What one must remember is that it is a common sense approach. The knowledge is already there. You need to just refer to certain books or certain guidelines or even the internet, and you will get the information. What you need to have is an attitude, a well rehearsed plan, and a willingness to push a particular point where it is required. This is especially so when you are interacting with outside agencies, whether it is the administration, whether it is the public health engineers, whether it is the media, and whether it is, for that matter, the population. You need to engage with the let's say community leaders. The community leaders are the opinion makers who we are dealing with. Now, unless you are, and it varies, like we have had situations where even religious leaders have been used to pass a particular message, because people are ill informed, they panic because of confusions, because of not knowing what exactly is causing it. There are cases on record where a particular few deaths among children due to vaccination has been blamed on the vaccine. Now those who are from the medical field know that certain types of vaccines can cause certain reactions, but majority are because of some other problem which has been unnecessarily blown out of proportion. So the only way to fight that off is to make sure that you are in good touch and communication. You go and meet the media leaders, the opinion leaders in the community, and find out what exactly is their viewpoint, what is their fears, what is the reason why they do not wish to accept a particular public health message that you are trying to do, and you will find out a method then to find a solution to the problem.
Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee. I actually a few points which I noted, and for the benefit of the students, I wanted to point out that it's very interesting how in a situation of epidemic we can use the local health practitioners.
Okay.
So that also points to the other larger issue of using Ayush in NRHM or co-locating Ayush.
Absolutely.
And also another point of communitization as noted in the NRHM. So in a situation, is it possible that in a situation of epidemics, where say in malaria epidemics, you see the seasonal cycle.
Correct.
So the community is aware that in a cycle, when there are larger cases of malaria and when there are less cases. So can this information also help them make a health plan?
Yes.
Whereby
this is very important, especially I can narrate from our personal experience. A very classical area of malaria spread is in the certain parts of Rajasthan. We always think of malaria as the northeast, but certain parts of Rajasthan has malaria, and the reason is because there is water shortage. They store water in underground sumps, and that is where the mosquito breeds. Now what is important to understand is, because the temperature starts rising quite early in the desert, the mosquito breeding cycle is essentially going to be confined quite early in the post-winter phase, and that is when the malaria cases outbreaks will take place, just before winter or just after winter. It is quite different from the picture that we see that malaria cases are going to occur in the rainy season. So this kind of information, if it is sort of shared with the people, it is important for them to understand. After all, everybody needs water, so they will have to store water, but there are ways to make sure that the water is stored without allowing the vector to breed in that area. So this information has to be passed on to the community, otherwise your public health measures don't work.
Yes. So we are very happy that you could spend time with us and to talk about the issues of epidemics, on how does one look at epidemics in the context of public health. And it's very interesting that the idea of public health itself has come up from epidemic outbreak, and we're very glad that you could also incorporate a very global picture of epidemics before getting into the nitty-gritty of epidemics, about the situation in London, the previous situation and the current situation, and how public health measures includes other departments, one can look at the public works department, the sanitation department. So we are very glad that it's an overall picture that one sees in public health.
Thank you.
Thank you.